What are the key tech trends driving the IT industry in India?
So we're looking at five key trends, aspects that are really shaping up the IT industry overall. The first one that we see is something that we've talked about for a long time, but that's broadly the changes that we see in the data space. We've talked about data aggregation, we've talked about data monetization over the past few years. What we find very interesting around data is that the data services space itself seems to be seeing a lot of renewed focus around structured data management. So there's obviously a lot of interesting things that are going on in the data analytics space, where you have a lot of cloud-based tools that have come in. But the world in some ways seems also at the same time, while there's a lot of push around big data and data analytics, also seems to be coming back to trying to address the core issue around how to handle structured data itself. So that's one. And that's something that we are fairly fixated on. That's a space that we are helping a lot of our clients come up with very active solutions around. Space one. Space two, as we see it, and this again has our attention as an organization, is the broad spectrum automation space. And when I say broad spectrum, what I mean by broad spectrum automation is automation as understood all the way from desktop automation and robotic process automation, which has significant demand and ask coming in, working all the way through what the industry these days calls digital process automation, which is the Pega play, the APN play in the market, leading on to the cognitive AI machine learning based automation frameworks that are being constructed. That's a space where, again, conversation has been ongoing for the last 24 odd months, but we see it becoming real these days. RDA, RPA, DPA, cognitive AI, ML based automation. So that's space number two. Space number three for us, again, is a space that seems to be morphing and playing out interestingly these days. That's more around the cloud. Now, cloud 5 years back was all around how does one figure out hosting solution providers, how does one create frameworks, and I suspect that journey has played out quite a bit. The interesting inflection point, which is where we find a lot of our clients coming in now, is centered around how to actually make that live transition. So folks have, and organizations have, worked out the broad term strategy. It is the actual migration, it is the hiccups that come in there, it is the realization that cost does not necessarily fall immediately. It is the realization that there is significant change around skills that the revised or the renewed organization needs once it transfers to the cloud. That is a conversation topic that is coming up, and that's where a lot of work seems to be getting directed to us. So that's space three. Space four for us is security, and I know Mr. Pawar talked about it a short while back. Security again seems to have morphed all the way from just firewall based or perimeter based security to looking at security more holistically and making sure that we start building it into the code itself as we develop applications. That's space four for us. Space five for us is what is an amalgam of what was called digital technologies and is increasingly emerging technologies. And in that digital technology space, what we're looking at is something that really has two axes to it. The first one is centered around customer experience and digitization across the organization, not just the front end. Because customer experience, a lot of our clients are realizing now, is not just a function of how many channels you can use to access information from an organization. It's more around how seamless the entire back-end process is to be able to support that information output getting generated. The second flavor on the digital front, on this pillar number 5, is the entire play around microservices, API factories, DevOps, as a way of reducing time to market and as a way of creating structures that are going to be more modularized and hopefully more effective over the long term. So those, Nick, are the 5 key trends that we see across the industry playing out. The whole data trend around structured data management, cloud, automation, digital, and security.
Okay, thank you. And so, obviously you're talking about using all these technologies. How are they going to impact, critical infrastructure in countries like transport systems or the financial services and banking?
Okay. So as you know, we work with clients primarily across 3 industries. Travel and transport is the first one, insurance is the second one, and banking financial services is the third one. We see each of these technologies, and there are somewhat separate flavors, differing flavors to these technologies, the way they play out across each of these areas. For instance, data monetization has always been something that's been an imperative of financial services firms. We see that aspect around potential data monetization now being looked at as a source of revenue generation for the travel sector. If you look at airlines these days, in our view, the biggest difference between the top 5 or the top 10 airlines in the world vis-a-vis the rest is the amount of revenue that they're able to generate using emerging technologies and using an intelligent usage, using the data that already goes through their systems more intelligently. So the best-in-class airlines these days are talking about somewhere around $40 per passenger of ancillary revenue that they're recognizing. And they recognize it because they look at the data that passes through their system, they make sense of it, they use technologies to allow the customers to interact with the airlines before they even board a flight and try to generate those revenues. So that's one example of where data plays in, obviously plays in financial services, but is increasingly playing in the travel transportation sector. Emerging technologies, what we find very interesting in a space like travel, for instance, is the entire experience around a seamless passenger transit through an airport terminal, which seems to be the holy grail these days of where airports are headed and where airlines would like customer experience to get to, is something again that is getting driven massively by what I talked about slightly earlier. It's by the digital experience and by a clutch of newer emerging technologies. Biometrics, for instance, the number of proof of concepts that are going on across the industry to make sure that instead of having physical boarding cards, passengers can actually walk in and just use an iris scan as a surrogate for a boarding card. IoT is a framework for making sure that bags do not end up getting lost and that bags can be tracked through a passenger journey all the way into making sure they're loaded into the same plane that a passenger is another example of where we see emerging technologies play out. Cloud, of course, is a common infrastructure framework. Cloud, especially for financial services and travel, where data redundancy is an absolute ask, is clearly the direction that most firms are moving in. We still see them coming up with structures that are hybrid structures, but the component which is virtualized within the data center and the component that is being taken out to the cloud, public cloud in most cases, has again been rising. So that's how we see this playing out.
Okay, great. And just a couple of questions on India. So what advice would you give to like a UK-based business looking to do business in India?
Correct. So I think the first piece of advice I would have is if you actually start contemplating India, a country with about $1.3 billion people, a massive domestic market, right? One way of approaching India would be to look at the entirety of the practices and the learnings that an organization in the UK has picked up by working across the UK and across the globe and trying to transfer it out. My advice to them would be, given the flavors and given the diversity within India, localization of the offerings or the products or the services that a UK-based firm tries to take to India is going to be an imperative. The standard line around India that a lot of people use is that there are many Indias within India. You can stratify it socially, you can stratify it regionally, and each of these markets are massive in terms of their ability to consume, and hence each one of them or a cluster of them can be attractive for UK-based businesses. Localization, in my opinion, of the offerings or the services is going to be key.
Okay, great. And finally, can you sort of describe, obviously the tech scene in the UK is quite advanced. What is it like in India?
It's extremely exciting at this point in time, Nick. So India is, I believe, number 2 or number 3 in terms of the tech startup ecosystem, number of tech startups that are out there in the market. There are outstanding examples of firms, homegrown firms that have become what in the industry parlance are called unicorns. So you have in the past, if you were to look at our journey, the journey was very services centric. We've got a lot of interesting players who come into the product space. We now have a lot of firms that have come into the e-commerce space and into variants of the e-commerce space who have now ramped up and are starting off with their base in India but now setting up markets across the world. So a very exciting entrepreneurial ecosystem in India, which has moved beyond services only to more of a products mindset as well.